Hello, I'm Lara. I'm from London and I've been living in Riga for almost 2 years. 2 years next month.
Hi, Lara.
Hello.
How are you?
Hot.
Me too. Me too. It's so unusually hot here, and it's just a very odd summer, odd time.
Yeah, I mean, some might say it's a perfect summer, but I think it's a perfect summer if I were on a beach on a sort of sun lounger.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the perfect time to be in a city, in my apartment, which has no fan or air conditioning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know you. I met you when we both actually came to Latvia around the same period of time. We met at a expat book club, which was the start of a beautiful friendship.
Oh, yes. For all of us.
Yeah. And actually, I think I've through you, I've learned a lot about where you're from, because we've gotten to talk a lot about the places that we've lived and things like that. So let's start with that. Tell us a little bit about what place you're from and what it's like.
I'm from a place called Tufnell Park in North London, in Islington. It's on the border of two boroughs, Islington and Camden. Camden is kind of famous, I guess, for being alternative, sort of centre of grunge and goths and punks and things like that. And so that's sort of what Camden Town is famous for. And Islington is known, is sort of laughed at and mocked, I guess, for being ridiculously left-wing and sort of liberal champagne socialists. That's kind of what people call us Islingtonites in other parts of the country. And there is some truth in that. But both areas, both Islington and Camden, and therefore Tufnell Park, it's a very sort of liberal-minded place with lots of people who perhaps live alternatively, which is a great place to grow up. And, seeing lots of people from lots of different walks of life. Obviously, London is incredibly diverse. And so, I kind of love the fact that from my little apartment, I can walk down to Holloway Road or Finsbury Park and see so many different cultures, and therefore have loads of really good food. And that's really the biggest plus of multiculturalism, is just having loads and loads of really good food everywhere all the time. So that's probably the best thing about going to London. And I'm planning to go to London in a few weeks. And like the number one thing that other than my family and friends, the number one thing, like, I'm going to go to this restaurant, this restaurant, this restaurant. So yeah, I'd say, like, for most people, that they think that London is Big Ben and the River Thames, and yeah, I'm not too far from that, by tube, but really most people who live in London, we stay in our little area, and you have a sort of residential area and it becomes like a small town. So it's not like you're living in a 9 million person city. You're sort of living in this small area, and that's why I say I'm from Tufnell Park specifically, because that's really where I live. It's not like I don't live in central London, it's not as glamorous as that.
So are you saying that a lot of people also work near the neighborhood that they live? I mean, is it that small of a radius?
No, I don't think that. I don't think that's the case. No, I mean, I have had quite a few local jobs, and my mum for 25 years, she worked for Camden Council. So, she definitely was always local and cycled to work. My friend Beth, my best friend, she has always worked locally. So yeah, there are people like that. But my dad works in South London. He goes across the river every day. And I used to work in West London, so I would go all the way across. Took me an hour to get to work when I was there. So no, it's unfortunately not. I think we would all prefer it if we could. Because commuting is one of the worst things, really, about living in a big city.
But the rest of your life seems to very much revolve around your neighborhood more than people might imagine. Someone from
I walk down the street
experiencing all of London.
Exactly. I walk down the street, I know people. You know, it's like a town. I walk down the street and I say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" You know, and my best friends, we all live reasonably close distance to each other. So actually, in terms of it being a community, it really is. And you know, we have community events, which my family are very involved in. We do a Christmas play every year, big Christmas play called the Pantomime. That is a particularly British thing to have at Christmas. And it's got lots of men dressed as women, women dressed as men, bawdy jokes, and sort of ridiculous over-the-top acting and huge costumes and things like that. So we have big those sorts of community events, and people say, "Oh, I saw you in the play," and you know, you build up a community even though you're in a massive city.
And that's interesting that you're talking about how people speak to each other, because one thing I'm hearing is that people speak to each other. But what is your perception of, like, from the inside, of what people are like in relation to other people in your area of London?
It is different in terms of if it's someone you don't know. You know, there's a certain anonymity that comes from being in a big city as well, which I think us as Londoners really appreciate. You know, it's something I like about Latvia too. You know, people don't try and invade your space. Everyone's got their own stuff to do. So in terms of my local community, if I see someone I know, then yeah, of course, I stop and speak to them on the street, and very friendly. And if there's some sort of way we're related in the local area, totally fine to stop and talk to me. But if you're walking down the street or you're on the bus and someone starts talking to you, please, no, what are you doing? I mean, like, I've got, you know, I put my headphones on. Do not talk to me unless you know me. That is kind of what it's like. So I've definitely heard from people that have been to London that they found it really unfriendly. And I don't think that's fair of the people. I think you have to remember that when you're surrounded by, I think it's between 9 and 12 million people, when you're surrounded by that many, there's quite a lot of weirdos. And you're also at risk, you know, you're at risk from people trying to rip you off or rob you or, you know, any of those sorts of things. It's a protection thing. You put up that barrier to protect you from harm. Ultimately, if someone stops me and says, "Hi, can you help me find Holloway Road? Can you help me find whatever?" Of course. I would never like go away, you know. But the whole like keeping yourself to yourself thing, it's a protection from all of the people in London that you don't want to talk to.
Yeah. Having lived in New York City, I think part of it too was that there are just too many people, there are too many stimuli. So even if you were a friendly person, and even if you wanted to talk to strangers, to talk to that many people coming in and out of your space constantly would be exhausting. It's just not possible. Although interestingly, like, there are little subtle differences. And so, like, for example, in New York, this was my perception, so I can't speak for everybody, but you look down at the ground. You don't look at other people ever. And in Riga is much smaller. So people actually walk down the street looking at other people and looking straight ahead. And that was a huge, even though it's a city in the city, that was a huge adjustment for me, because I'm so used to kind of even staying out of people's space by not looking at anyone.
I used to look down at the ground because I was trying to avoid dog's business, or whatever you want to call it politely, which was like poo everywhere. It used to be really bad. Like, there was one particular street, and my dad used to call it poo path, because you couldn't walk down that street and look ahead. There's no way. You'd end up having to clean your shoes. So that was one of the reasons I learned to look down. But I found, like, you know, having that, you know, meant that I don't think I walk with so straight with my head up, because I think I have been brought up to sort of be looking down and sort of I wonder if it's had an effect on my posture and the way that I walk. And I think as well, like, you know, walking with a bit of an attitude in London can kind of get you away from issues. They, you know, people look criminals or whatever, they're going to look for the weakest link, right? So, you know, as long as you walk where you know where you're going and you're not interested in anyone else, you're probably going to be fine. I mean, as far as that's been my experience, I've never had any problems. I feel very safe in London, but I think coming here, you realize that I feel much safer here. I mean, like, I don't even think about it. Like, as you say, I can walk down the street and I don't need to think about how I'm walking or any of those sorts of things. And you don't notice that you've done that for your whole life until you realize you don't need to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, until you have that contrast. How would you compare and contrast Londoners compared to English culture in general, or people from different places? Because I know your family is not necessarily originally from London.
No, my mum is from the north of England, and my dad is half Scottish, half Swiss, but was brought up in Bedford, which is about an hour, less than an hour out of London. I think London is a completely different place to the rest of England, and really is basically a different country. I mean, we have a different culture, and you see that even reflected in elections, in terms of how London votes and in terms of how the rest of the UK votes, you know, including Brexit. London voted to remain. And part of being in London is being part of a multicultural community. I would imagine if you're a racist, you have a pretty hard time of it in London, because like, you're going to be absolutely hating your life. So I don't think there are. I mean, obviously there are racists there, but you know, I think we, as a general rule, we're quite accepting of others, quite accepting of people being different. We've got such a vibrant multicultural community. But whereas I don't see that in the rest of the UK. Okay, some other places, Birmingham, some other big cities, but I think, you know, the countryside in England is, I think, still quite old-fashioned. There's still very conservative, with both a small and a big C views. And often when you look at the votes, that's the situation. They vote for the Conservative Party in the counties often, and in the cities they vote generally for the Labour Party or opposition parties, Green Party, things like that. Generally, you know, but the counties are sort of stuck in this. And when you go there, it's like that. I mean, it's beautiful. You go and there are these cottages, and, you know, they've been there for hundreds of years, and you know, they're all growing things in their gardens, and they have flower competitions, and, you know, they wear bonnets. I mean, it's literally like going back to a different time, but but therefore their attitudes are like that too. And then you have other places in England which have been totally left behind and are not very nice places, where they've had lack of funding, they've been underfunded and things like that, which you know, and you don't see those places generally. People wouldn't be aware of those places, but there are quite a few places where you go, and you know, where my aunt and my cousins and my grandmother live, been so ruined by the destruction of the steel industry in the UK. And you walk up and down the high street, and it's just half the shops are boarded up, And every time we go there, it's the best place for fish and chips, right? So every time we go there, we get fish and chips. You've got to do that when you're there, because the north of England does the best ones. Just that's a fact. And you go up there, and it's just it's really depressing. It's really depressing. But all of those people who were all employed by the steelworks have all lost their jobs, and so unemployment's rife. So you've got sort of three Britons, I guess. You've got the sort of posh, well-to-do period drama. Then you've got these sort of places that have been destroyed by lack of industry and things like that. And then you've got the cities, which have different viewpoints completely. So there's sort of three different Britons, really.
You talk a little bit about the multiculturalism and diversity of London. When did you actually start thinking about or experiencing going out in the world, meaning traveling further afield? What did that look like for you?
I do think it was more my parents' stories that inspired my brother and I, because going on family holidays, staying in a villa, and yes, we all had a really good time, and I really enjoyed family holidays. But I didn't. It was this idea of traveling that really excited me. And we have a thing in the UK. Normally, when you finish your secondary education, which is at 18, right? When you finish your A levels, we call them, the exams. You finish them. A lot of people take what is called a gap year before they go to university. So you take 1 year out to do some work, to travel, to just have a bit of fun before you go back to school. And quite a few of my friends went to Thailand and places like that, and I just spent all my money. And so I ended up just doing 1 month, but I just did 1 month around Europe. And I just traveled on trains, Interrail. And that was sort of in my mind, doing a gap year before university and going and doing all of these, traveling during that time was something we all looked forward to for years. And we'd started going on holiday when we were about 17 together as a group of girls. We all went, on little mini breaks to like Amsterdam and places like that. So it had started to become more normal to go on holiday in Europe for just a quick, 4 days or whatever. And it was cheap. You could get a flight for £50. So I traveled around then. And that was sort of where the bug began, I suppose. But I do think it was, my mum and dad telling their stories, I think, was the biggest thing that made me and my brother both want to go traveling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think from an American perspective, it's always fascinating. Because the United States is one big country, even though it's all these other states that all have their own separate cultures, we don't think about traveling quite in the same way, even though people tend to drive a lot and take road trips and visit other states. And so therefore, a lot of us are really fascinated by the fact that European countries are basically the size of most of our states, and that people travel from a country to another country, and that it's so accessible, seems really fascinating.
I mean, it's even more accessible for those on the continent because, for us, we have to get off the island. Mm-hmm. But, when you're here in the continent, it's so easy to just, and I'm really looking forward to Latvia getting these new trains, because mm-hmm. once we can get train access to the rest of Europe, I mean, it's so easy. I traveled the whole way around, twice I've done it, all going around Europe on trains and buses, and it's so easy. And you're suddenly in a completely different place, with a different language and different food, and it's a really lucky to be here.
Yeah. And where did the first inkling of living abroad come from? Was it a circumstance? Did you consciously plan to do that?
Because my mum had lived in France and still speaks French, which I now realize is because my mum is a linguist and I'm not. But you know, I thought, oh, you just go to a place for a year and then you speak the language. That's easy. So I really have a love for Latin America. And especially when I was about 15, 16, I totally fell in love with the idea of Latin America. And I was learning Spanish at school. From age 11, I was learning Spanish. And I kind of just had this idea that I could go to South America for a year and I'd come back and I'd speak Spanish for the rest of my life, and that'd be it, it'd just be done. And I'd have all these amazing experiences, you know, like, I don't know, hiking through the mountains with wearing a poncho. You know, I had basically stereotypical views.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it was this magical world. And so, yeah, partly I based my studies on that. You know, I studied extra Spanish. I really wanted to be able to speak Spanish, and sort of live that Latin American dream. But the first sort of decision I made with it, my friend Lisa, I'm a teacher and she's a teacher too, but at the time I wasn't a teacher. And I remember standing on our friend's balcony having a cigarette, and it was like, you know, it was late night. We'd had quite a few glasses of wine, and we were talking, and basically she had got this job. She'd been offered this job in Peru. And we're talking about all her preparations for that and all of these sorts of things. And I remember just specifically being like, wow, as a teacher, you can just go and get a job in another country. Like, there's no barrier to that once you've been trained. Yeah. And I just thought, and she just moved to Peru. She just did it. And I just thought, wow, she just did it, you know, amazing. And, you know, me and Beth, we went to visit her, me and my best friend, we went to visit her, and it was just amazing. I thought, well, how incredible that she's living in Lima. Wow, this is exactly what I dreamed of. So so then I signed up that night for teacher training in the UK.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I got on, and then I did my teacher training, which is a year, and then I did 2 years teaching in London, because to be a teacher you need to have at least 1 year's experience as well. It's called newly qualified teacher year. You have to do that.
So a year of courses, and then at least a year of actual physical teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you have a reduced timetable during that time, so that you don't get overwhelmed, and you have to do some more paperwork in that year too. Mm-hmm. And then you're a fully fledged teacher the next year. So I did my training. So it was 3 more years before I was ready to go out into the world. And then I just applied, and it was the first job I'd applied for. Or certainly I hadn't been doing it very long. I just sort of like saw it and applied to go to Panama and got it. And so within a week, I think it was literally within 5 days of the original application, I was suddenly signing a contract and moving to Panama in the 4 months' time or something. And it was just like, what the hell? Yeah, it was quite intense.
Wow. So you brought up an interesting point, which I think is really true, that we have these perceptions of the way a place is going to be, right? That if I go to Peru, I'm going to wear a traditional Peruvian poncho and I'm going to be up in the mountains, you know, and maybe playing like a little flute or something. But in reality, you know, maybe there's parts of that are true about the culture, but things can be different. So tell us about arriving to Panama and what maybe lived up to some of the things that you expected, or new things that you discovered that you really loved, and what was very different or very challenging.
Well, if you think about Panama City, it's quite Americanized, like North Americanized. So, you know, there's a lot of sort of American chains, Dunkin' Donuts and and things like that. And the skyline's almost sort of Miami or that sort of thing. You've got this massive, it's called the Cinta Costera. It's like a big, long road along the sea. And that skyline could easily be in the United States. You know, it could be on that. I just always think of that Miami TV show with the detectives. Yeah, it reminds me of that.
Miami Vice. Okay, I got you.
So there's like that aspect to it, and like it's very different. It's very difficult to describe. Like, as in, they don't really listen to salsa. There's like it's just a different type of Latin American than the Latin American stereotype, which I think the stereotype, there are, like you say, there are truths in it. When you go to Peru, you go to Bolivia, yeah, there are lots of people in traditional dress, and they really do still dress like that. And it's a very different culture in that way. Whereas I'd say that, like, in Panama City, most people dress in sort of like a rapper, you know, like it's more sort of reggaeton culture with like maybe you might think it's got quite close links to Puerto Rico or something like that. It's sort of this American Latin. That's just Panama City. Like, outside of Panama City it's different, and there are parts of Panama City that are far more sort of old school Panamanian. It's a strange place, mainly because of the canal and because of what they call the American invasion, right? So there's like loads of immigrants came to Panama to work on the canal. They've got a huge Chinese population, which I don't think they have in any other part of Latin America that I've seen in those numbers. In terms of, like, every single corner store that you go to, it will sell dim sum. Like, and that's a standard. And so the really strong links to China, and also just loads of other people from loads of other different countries came to work on the canal. You know, loads and loads of people worked on the canal. But also, in terms of import and export, it was a massive hub, and that, of course, leads to there being a lot of foreigners. So what you find with Panama is that if you go into the mainland, then most people there are lots of sort of indigenous tribes and things like that, which still exist and still live in the way that they used to live as much as they can. Some people in very distant places that are inaccessible by road. You know, some people still live in the jungle, completely in the jungle, like in the Darien Gap, which is the most difficult place to survive on the planet, or one of them, and they still live there. You know, so you've got that sort of aspect which still exists and is still kind of untouched. But then in Panama City, it's very much a different situation. It's a kind of an immigrant population. So, and then with the American invasions, they call it, so you basically had the canal. The Americans took control of what was called the Canal Zone, and that area was almost exclusively run by North Americans who have been brought over. And so now there's all these people called Zonians, and they are the descendants of people who lived in the Canal Zone when it was under American control. And so you have this area, like where I worked, Clayton, which used to be exclusively North American. And they, you know, this was totally like controlled. Like, you had to have your passport to go through and everything like that. And it was a huge percentage of Panama. I mean, Panama's a small place, and the Canal Zone stretched for quite a wide, what's the word? It was area. Quite a width on either side. And even the architecture's different. So that influence was very, very strong. And I think that they left at 99. I think it was 99. But it's got a lot of American influence because of that. But I don't think they would be happy to think about that. I don't think that's a lot of people are still very angry about. There were some incursions by the CIA. There was situation where an area in sort of the old town was I think bombed, and there's still memorials and things about that. You know, don't forget what the Americans did to us. So there's this weird tension as well, because they're kind of living with this mixture of cultures, but there's an anger towards that too. And I think that's probably the case in other Latin American countries that have had CIA involvement, but I think it's far more prevalent in Panama because of how much control they had over the canal.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect to be able to go to Dunkin' Donuts.
I wouldn't have either. Yeah.
No. So that was unusual. But I guess, you know, in terms of the noise and the vibrancy and, like, you know, the color and all of those sorts of things, and the love for dancing, yeah, that's definitely was real. And they really do know how to party. And also, obviously, I mean, you know, it's the Caribbean, so beautiful beaches, you know, that's what you would expect. Palm trees everywhere, yes. You know, impossible heat, yes, that's there. You know, it's and the old colonial buildings are exactly what you imagine. And when you go to somewhere in Colombia like Cartagena, you really see those buildings at their best. And in Panama, you've still got a sort of half and half of like ruined colonial buildings, and also ones that have been done up and are now overpriced and generally have foreigners living in them. So there are things that you very much like. Yeah, I mean, the noise, you know, it's just everyone is loud and expressive, and I kind of said this to the taxi drivers there, you know, when they asked me what the difference between England and Panama is, and I said, well, I think you can see it through the weather. Because in the weather in England is generally drizzle. It's generally just a dirge of grey, and just grey all the time. And generally people are quite pessimistic. They're not particularly overly emotional when they speak to each other, and it fits the weather. You go to Panama, the weather is incredibly hot, and then suddenly it is the most massive electric storm, purple clouds, lightning coming from all directions, the heaviest rain you could ever see, the loudest thunder you could ever hear, the most dramatic storm, and then again blistering heat, you know, and so you have this crazy tropical temperature, and I do think your people are affected by the weather that they are brought up in. And that was what they were like, you know, really passionate people, and exciting to talk to, and always loads of energy and always very loud, and that's basically the opposite of Latvia.
Perfect segue. So how did you end up from Panama all the way up across the ocean in Latvia?
Well, basically my company that I work for now, it has a school here and it has a school in Panama. And I wanted to be nearer home. And I think that the way that I am fits better in a colder part of the world, because I'm not really very good in the heat, and you know, I'm not someone who likes sunbathing, and so I think I struggled with that. I struggled with the heat. It was never somewhere that I was going to be able to stay for a long time because of that. It just doesn't fit me. So I came over here because I wanted to do a transfer. And I originally asked for a transfer to Germany, which makes sense, right? That's a normal place to go. And then
it's the place that almost every single person that has been on these interviews who has talked about potentially living in another country in Europe has always said Germany.
Yeah, but Germany's great. I mean, it's a really great place. And it's culturally very similar to the UK, although they probably wouldn't like me saying that, but I think it is. but yeah, and I had been to Latvia before for a little weekend trip with some of my girlfriends, and you know, it was nice, but I really didn't have much knowledge of it at all. I mean, I didn't know how to say thank you or please or anything like that. But I'd applied for this job in Germany and I got it, then it fell through. And then they said to me, oh, there's another job coming up in our school in Latvia. Would you be interested in that? And I was like, yeah, why not? So that's basically how it happened. And then suddenly I was traveling halfway across the world again to a place from a tropical heat oven to the coldest place. And with, I mean, I genuinely think it's almost an opposite. And like I said, with Panama, it's you know, the place with exuberance and passion and color and all of those sorts of things, and Latvians are generally not very loud at all. And my best example is going to the doctors, because in Panama you go to the doctor, and when you walk into the waiting room, everyone says hello to you. And what the hell's that about? Why are you talking to me? I'm just here for an appointment. You don't know what my appointment's about. It might be embarrassing. I don't want to talk to you. And then, and then in the elevator as well, you get into an elevator in Panama, and everyone just says hello, hello, everyone, hello, hello, hello. And why are you talking to me? Because as a Londoner, you've never talked to anyone in a lift. No, thank you. And then you come here, and I remember coming into my apartment building, and I went into the elevator, and other people took the stairs just so they didn't have to be in the elevator with me. And this was pre-COVID. And I've had that happen to quite a few times here, where if I get in the lift, someone goes, oh, and then takes the stairs. Well, just get in the lift, there's enough space. So it's like the complete opposite. It's like anything to not be anywhere near anyone. Whereas in Panama, it's all, let's be squished together and speak to each other, speak to random people all the time. So yeah, it's a completely opposite country, I would say.
And what did the first few months of adjustment look like here?
So much easier. I mean, my first few weeks in Panama, I did a Spanish course. So I went early. No one else arrived for the job yet, and it was just me there early. And on the first day, I got 43 mosquito bites. I mean, I was so upset, I counted them. And you know, and it was tough. I couldn't sleep. I ended up having to change hotels. Then that hotel had loads of noise, and it was just like really. It was an unusual period of time. And then, but here, like, it just felt like completely normal. I just feel like Riga is a very European city, and so it didn't feel that different from being at home in the UK. And it felt like somewhere I knew. It felt like, you know, I understand this culture. I understand this place. Things work how I expect them to work. And I found an apartment within less than 2 weeks, and just sort of, it just felt like I came here and it was fine.
Yeah, things fell into place for you.
Yeah. But also because I'd already moved to somewhere else, I knew what mistakes I'd made. So I knew that in Panama, I had relied too heavily on my work colleagues, and I hadn't explored my hobbies in enough. And by the end of my time in Panama, I'd learned, you know, the things that I wanted that would make me feel at home. So I joined a theatre in Panama. And had I joined that right at the beginning, I would have, I'm sure, done so many more performances and met so many more people. But, you know, but I just didn't even think about it. The first thing I did when I arrived in Riga was find an acting group to join that did plays, because I knew I wanted to do that, and joined the book club. And, I immediately like joined all of these different things because I'd learned, from the hard way, from, when I was in Panama, realizing the only people I knew were people from work, and therefore only English people. And, that's not what I wanted to be in Panama for. So, I think I learned to do it much better and was much more efficient in setting up a life.
Yeah. Yeah. So just like traveling somewhere is different from living somewhere, having lived somewhere previously and being an expat in yet another country gives you perspectives around just your own adjustment and ability to adjust to those places. That's really interesting.
Yeah. You learn what you need to be happy, I think. Because it is like what anyone says, you're always just going to be you in another place, right? I mean, wherever you go, it doesn't change you, I don't think, in such a dramatic way that people might think. That I still can't speak Spanish, for example. No, I mean, my Spanish is okay. It's okay, but it's not like my mum's French, and that's annoying. But you are yourself in another place. You're not going to become suddenly this amazing different person that you imagine yourself like you're not going to suddenly become a traditional Peruvian woman living in a mountain. That's not what's going to happen. You're just going to be you. So find the things that stabilize you. Find the things that make you happy.
Wonderful advice. What other memories or even kind of current things would you reflect on in terms of things that felt culturally similar? Like you're talking about this familiarity. What are some of those maybe things that you can pinpoint that feel familiar, and what are some things that felt really different from what you're used to?
I think the architecture made me feel at home here. It's particularly in the center, it just feels very European, and the transport system, it's effective. That's nice. The things that were different, well, I finally last winter experienced this level of snow, minus 21. The first winter I was here, it wasn't that cold. And then, so I was really glad to experience the cold weather this winter just gone, and make a snowman and enjoy the snow. And I went running. I loved going running in the snow. I really enjoyed it. And I don't know, it's magical. In England, it rains all the time, and so we don't often get snow, and it's always exciting when we do. But having snow for as long as we did here, it was such a long time that we had snow. That was just such a special thing. That felt really different. It felt like, wow, I'm really living in the Baltic states. Because people's there's a phrase in England, I don't know if you say this in the States, but in England, if it's really cold, someone will say, oh, it's cold out there, and someone will say, yeah, it's Baltic. It's like
absolutely not said in the States.
Yeah, so that's an expression we have. And I was kind of like, people say that, but it doesn't make any sense because I'm in the Baltic states and it's really not that cold. And then this year it was like minus 21. Okay, yeah.
Well, where I grew up is way colder than the average here, so I don't find this that cold. Although this last winter was a bit unusual. It was fairly cold, and we had lots of snow for way longer than maybe is typical in recent years. It
was really a long time. The winter lasted a long time. Yeah,
I thought it was lovely too. So when you reflect on having traveled and then first living abroad for the first time and then living abroad for the second time, what are things that you think of that you might relay to someone interested in the difference between traveling and living abroad?
I guess it probably depends on what job you're doing. But in terms of being a teacher, most of your life is work. So when you're living in that place, it's a lot of it is you're going to be at work. And that, if you're working at an international school, it doesn't feel that different from working in the UK system. I mean, I've only worked in British system schools, so I've almost been able to use all of my resources and everything like that. It's just a crossover. So I think finding a school that you're happy in is important, or if that's what you're going to do, finding a job that you're happy in. Because yes, of course, it's exciting to go and live in a new place, but you're also living day to day. You need to make sure that you're living somewhere that you really that you want to actually live in, and not just somewhere that you want to travel. I think there are like places that I would live, and there are places that I would love to go to, but I don't want to live there. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a big difference. No, I mean, when you're going traveling, you kind of every day you're seeing all of the fun stuff. You see all the best parts of a country, and you don't have to deal with any bureaucracy most of the time. And it's just, yay, I'm on a boat, yay, I'm in the sea, I'm snorkeling, wow. It's not like day to day doing your paperwork, sitting in your apartment, cooking, those sorts of things. It's a very different experience. I don't think they're relatable, really. I think a lot of people say they would like to live abroad, but in reality, it's not like being on holiday. It's not. It's you in another place, like I said. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But obviously, you get loads of things out of it as well. A whole different community. You learn a whole different culture, different experiences that you wouldn't have in your own country. Made lots of new friends, those sorts of things. So you do get a lot out of it. And also as a teacher, if you're coming from the UK, and I'm sure if you're coming from the US as well, the workload is reduced in comparison to what you're expected to do there. So you can have more of a life and a work-life balance as long as you're at the right school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So do you have any final thoughts?
I suppose, just as a final thing, is that I found coming to Latvia is something that's made me happy. Actually, I feel like I fit here. And as you say, that there are cultural similarities, similar sense of humor, sort of dark with darkness beneath it, and I found everything that I could want, my drama group, my book club, and all of these different things, and friends, and so for me, coming to Latvia, rather than being a culture shock, was more like coming home after a culture shock, and so for me, it's I definitely feel like I'm in the right place.
Lovely. That's a great place to end. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and for sharing bits and pieces of what your experience has been. And yeah.
Thank you.